Hi, I'm Dave Maritu. I'm the chair of the Black Members Standing Committee and a member of the National Executive Committee. I'm very pleased to introduce this very important witness film. Whether you share or are shocked by these very frank and revealing witness statements, I think it's very important that you hear what black members of staff have to face in the world of work in both the FE and HE sectors.
For me, the covert is this hidden, insidious sort of racism, and the overt racism is when somebody's actually calling you those names or the actual acts of violence. But for me, it's the covert racism that we now have to deal with, and I would suggest that it's intelligent racists.
I mean, I think that's really interesting what you're saying. We face a lot of racism in our workplaces, which is framed and spoken in ways that makes it very difficult for black staff to get redress.
I want to work, I want my job. I don't want to feel that, every day I go to this place that makes me feel trapped and abused and discriminated against, and that every time I look around I'm wondering what other negative effect I'm going to have to deal with.
We need to rethink trade union responses to racism, and partly it is about evidencing and seeking remedy. But I also feel that we have a real job to try and prevent everyone having to seek remedy, because if really every one of our black members went to remedy, it's again kind of so widespread and individualised. And there's something about us re-educating the sector to understand, well, this is racism and this is the consequence
there
of it.
isn't anything that you can do to stop what's happening, and you're still having to endure it. And each day you're wondering what sort of look, what's going to happen, what sort of impact is this racism going to have on today? What am I going to have to tolerate? What am I going to have to put up with? And what am I going to have to face knowing that it's unfair? I think it can be quite dangerous to discuss racism at work in various ways. I think people are worried about the response they're going to get. It's not always a response that's about addressing the complaint of racism or the identification of racism. It's often a response of more racism, of victimisation, of being told you have got a chip on your shoulder, of being often disregarded, of being ignored. I think a lot of the time there is a feeling that what's the point? I'm not going to be heard. This could make matters worse. I might not actually be addressing the situation. I might actually be giving someone ammunition to make life more difficult for me.
Black workers are often seen as people who possibly make excuses, have a chip on the shoulder and those kinds of things. And so I guess what happens is a lot of the time we edit what we say on the basis of some sense of how we might be received. And I suppose that in itself creates a kind of a general kind of state of being under the gaze, a kind of a state of tension, really. But I wouldn't say in my experience that I've ever felt it being dangerous as such, but certainly it can be uncomfortable, and you end up self-censoring.
I've experienced racism many times, and the straightforward racism that's out and overt is less hateful than the subliminal undermining by white colleagues which gnaws at you and doesn't terminate because you can't have evidence to actually tackle the problem.
I think there are a couple of things. I think the first thing is that there's an assumption in higher education where I work that it already is a progressive workplace and that problems of racism don't exist. And so when you try to raise these sorts of issues, it's sort of like, oh, you know, we don't have to deal with those sorts of problems. I think another issue, though, is also the kind of the way that people feel insecure in their jobs. Because of casualization, because of the cuts and redundancies that are happening at the moment, and also because of the kind of hyper-competitive environment connected to the ref. Sometimes there's a sense that your face doesn't fit, and it's not really attributed directly to being sort of a race issue, but it's often something that's more indirect and more subtle, and so it's really teasing that stuff out.
I think staff who work in further and higher education find it very, very difficult to explicitly talk about racism at work, so that people use kind of codes, secrets. They have a very small circle that they'll talk about things openly with. But in our broader workplace, it's almost impossible to use the R word, that despite all of the extremely bad experiences that black staff have, including lack of opportunity for promotion and training, being disproportionately targeted for complaints and disciplinaries and redundancy and everything that you would expect in any big set of workplaces. Sadly, in our sector, and I include our union colleagues, there's this sense that we're nice, educated people, how dare you call me a racist? So to even name racism as the thing you're experiencing is almost impossible for nearly everybody.
Generally, I am reluctant to raise issues of racism at work, whether it be from students, colleagues, or management. But I do on occasion when it's getting out of hand. Yeah.
I think that primarily there's a lot of pressure on black staff to simply kind of fit into a dominant discourse and effectively kind of deracialise themselves and become part of the kind of system and be rewarded accordingly. And on the whole, my experience is that if people subjugate race, then they are much more likely to be seen as kind of acceptable to the organisation. And if you discuss racism, the very discussion seems to trigger two things. One, it's a reminder to the white liberal establishment that the experience of being black is not the same experience as that of being white. And that very experience seems to kind of trigger in many white liberal educators kind of a whole range of kind of emotions, from kind of guilt to fear to kind of to anger to almost a sort of sense of being kind of immobilised.
I think white colleagues and managers in particular are determined not to be labelled racist, so they're often very defensive. And one thing I can say about the advances we've made is that being labelled a racist is a very toxic thing to be labelled. So their defence often can mean that the complainant is often attacked and maybe seen as or mentioned as a troublemaker, or with someone with a chip on his shoulder.
I've been at my university now for 11 years. When you're working in a faculty and you're the only black person, it's incredibly isolating as well. Now, although universities have this policy of diversity, it hasn't happened where I have worked. They do have more black students, but having students at university doesn't actually make it diverse. Is what you actually do once they're there, how they're supported, and so on. So students come to the university and they fail, and then they get blamed because they've come to the university. But diversity is a lot more than that. So.
I absolutely believe that my ethnicity has a major impact on the way I'm treated by colleagues, managers, students. I think that I've found on many occasions where someone with a more acceptable, almost Caucasian or Europeanized look, might be with regards to hair, clothing, or even the way they carry themselves, or the things that they're associated with, may often get a little bit of an easier time, because it's not so difficult, it's not so dangerous to enact with someone who's a little bit less out there with their ethnicity. As a black person living in the West, you're always positioned as the other. And in some situations that can be not only the other, but the other as the exotic other, or the other as the dangerous other. So I guess the racism tends to be partly a kind of a background kind of hum, where you always feel a bit like you're always having to justify yourself.
And I haven't actually experienced, I don't think, direct cases of discrimination, but I'm very, very aware of the fact that I don't possess a certain kind of authority that I would have if I were white or if I were male. And there is a sense that there's a kind of underlying sense of maybe trying to have to be twice as good or try twice as hard, because you're trying to overcome the fact that you don't have that sense of sort of immediate authority or entitlement that you would have if you're in a more privileged position.
So that when black staff try to say what is happening to me is racism, there's a hugely disproportionate backlash against them without an attempt to understand what black staff are saying about their experience. And of course, people see that and think, well, I'll just keep quiet about that then. I'll find another way of expressing myself or finding a resolution.
Generally, you feel reluctant. Sometimes I lose my temper as a result of it. But it does kind of bring home that there are issues which need to be addressed.
I think we all kind of play to greater and lesser degrees certain sort of, certain games where the organisation tells us that they want kind of black academics, but it sometimes seems that they kind of want our visibility and colour, but they don't want the kind of range of experiences and passions and kind of angers and realities that we bring. Be prepared to say that I bring into the organisation all that I am, and all that I am includes my class, my race, my gender, and my racialised experiences.
I found managers to be quite patronising towards me, more so than my white colleagues. Also, well, in particular, previous place I used to work, I had quite a few run-ins with the principal as I was a union rep at the college, and he would often be quite dismissive when I challenged his decisions or the way the institution worked.
The real racisms that I've faced or witnessed in the workplace are about being targeted to be pushed out of work, having a disproportionate workload, explicitly being told or being written about as having a chip on my shoulder, always wishing to use trade union issues around equality. This stuff is very overt and very damaging, and however much the day-to-day rudeness hurts you, the thing that will push you out of your job is that sustained, institutionalised campaign.
It's a bit like a kind of, it's a bit like death by a thousand cuts, yeah? Where one of those cuts in and of itself could be quite a normal experience, but when you experience them all the time, then those micro kind of aggressions then have a cumulative effect.
In terms of whether I've raised issues around racism at work, I mean, one of the, I know that one issue I've had to bring up quite a bit is the fact that our staff is really unrepresentative of our student population, and I'm saying this because of having been in many situations one of the handful of black staff in institutions sometimes where black students are the majority, I would say, and when I've raised this sort of issue, it's like you often get these responses like, oh, you know, we don't have people or the right people applying and that sort of thing. And again, it's brought down to a quality issue.
I do feel I can raise issues of racism at work. I think I'm lucky in the fact that I've been a union rep and I'm quite an experienced union rep, so I can depersonalise many of the race issues because I can use ACAS guidelines when talking about race and then not really having to talk about my own personal situation. I can also use legislation like the Equality Act, and that depersonalising it is sort of a safety net for me, something that can shield my own personal feelings about the racism that I experienced and the isolation that brings me.
Any problems I have with racism, I'm now wise to put it in writing so that there is an accurate record of it.
You have to be open, but you should also not pretend that it doesn't come with any risks. But you can limit the risks by being part of a union or a collective body that can support you when things end up going wrong. So I think that's the sort of dilemma that comes about when you discuss challenging racism in your own workplace. There are moments when it can actually take a revenge on you later.
We started by talking directly to the registrar and senior management, and we demanded a few change, and with this did manage to impact how the race agenda in the university developed. One of our success story with the university that they appointed associated vice presidents for equality and diversity that have made the agenda heard at the level of senior management. In the meantime, in the grassroots, we were developing our network, getting people believe that we can make a change.
But when it comes to making the decisions, the people don't look like me. The people that are making decisions usually don't have any ideas about who I am besides what they can visibly see, and it doesn't look like them. It doesn't fit in with who their friends are. I think it's difficult. I think institutions are racist, but I think politically and socially people are programmed almost to be racist, and it's about white people and privilege. Why would you give it up?
I mean, on the whole, colleagues have been kind of much more receptive and responsive and kind of colleague-like. I mean, there have been one or two exceptions to that, but in the main, particularly if it's a fairly kind of diverse group of colleagues or people coming from quite different social and political kind of backgrounds, then there may be some sort of certain kind of points of kind of connection. I think with students, I mean, again, students are so hugely diverse. I mean, black students are often normally both surprised and normally extremely pleased not only to see a black academic, but somebody who will kind of advocate on their behalf and actually kind of challenge some of the racism which they as students kind of experience in the system. I have found managers in the university sector quite different to managers in the local authority sector. In general, I find them far more threatened, far less able to kind of break out of that idea of kind of liberal academia and really kind of engage with the kind of the issues.
I think the other one is this sense of fear of failure, because you're not allowed to fail. And if in case you do fail, then somehow you get this impression that is not just about the normal everyday kind of developmental kind of process, but that somehow is a kind of a justification as to why you shouldn't be there in the first place, particularly in academia, as if it was that you were there by false pretenses and that those pretenses have been revealed in maybe getting something wrong. So I think that's where you feel the kind of racism.
It's very easy, I find, in trade unions to think that it's only the bread and butter industrial issues that matter, but it's really important to remember that questions around equality are central to this as well.
It is racist to go into an organisation, be expected to operate as though you're white, male and kind of from a middle class, traditional academic background. You know, if you come into an institution from a black female working class background, that is part and parcel of who you are. Racism operates in the sense of, I've experienced it in terms of denial, in terms of an academic institution that has huge numbers of black and ethnic minority students, but continues to operate as presumably, you know, many institutions as it probably did in the days when higher education was for kind of a fairly kind of elite group. The organisation would not necessarily recognise that as racism. But of course, as black people, we know it's racism.
Often I think staff in HE and FE believe, and I think believe with some justification, that the moment at which they name their experience of racism is the moment at which they're starting to leave that workplace. Because it's very, very hard to come back from the moment of saying in our places of employment that not only am I having a bad time, but the bad time I'm having is because of this. And sadly, I can think of almost no cases where I have had an input, whether it's formal or informal, where those individuals did not sooner or later exit that particular workplace, regardless of any formal process that had gone on.
Gone to all meetings that are discussing issues on race to give my viewpoint. But I think that's the thing that's really missing, that in terms of solidarity, we have different interests at work and we tend to be divided and split. So what I would call solidarity is black staff all working together. But when you are down, you don't see many of them behind you. They've all disappeared. I don't know the reason why, but I always try to make sure that when they are down, I'm always there to show them that it's not nice to be on your own. Maybe we need to find better ways of dealing with our problems. So my view is to maybe work on all black members to say a problem for one of us is a problem for all of us, and we might get somewhere.
My experience at the University of Manchester is that as our branch executive has become more diverse, we've been more adept and better at challenging racism in the workplace. So I feel that the UCU should review its standing orders to ensure that the branches are more diverse, and therefore we can then have a more diverse membership at national level, and therefore also be able to challenge the institutions at the various branches, because the more diverse the branch executives are, the better they will be at challenging racism.
If people are actually involved in the branch, then they'll be more aware of what those issues are and be a better place to take it forward. And I think, unfortunately, there's been a history within trade unionism about, being dominated by kind of, older white men, which unfortunately, I do have to say is still the case today. But I think that if we work towards having better representation, I think we can challenge that. If you talk to other black colleagues, I find that's often helpful just on an informal level, so that you feel you are not alone. I think that's one thing. But as well, I would say that in terms of the union, I would say again, encouraging more black members of staff to become actively involved in the union. I think that's an important strategy. So it's not a question of, for example, a very mixed kind of membership being led by a predominantly white branch committee, for example. But as well, here in the West Midlands region, we're trying to set up a black members network, and so we're hoping that will encourage dialogue on the regional level and support and sharing information and experience and that sort of thing.
Because of the principles, because of the aims, the goals, the manifesto that unions have, This is a place where there are tools that we can use to try and address that institutional racism, and also to make sure that the union does what it needs to do in order to promote racial harmony and those other good things that can come from looking at equality in a positive way. I will always be a trade unionist, so I'll always be part of that work, I hope, and hopefully be part of making sure that the unions and community merge, because I think there's a lot of power, a lot of influence that could happen from that merging.
I think in terms of getting your trade union branch to assist you in challenging racism at work, there's a lot of variation between branches, and I've been caught out by that because I've worked in different places. But I have sometimes been in the happy situation where I have colleagues among the trade union branch who are very committed to addressing issues of equality and challenging racism at work. And in those instances, there have been some quite productive outcomes. I've also seen and experienced times when trying to raise issues of racism makes it almost impossible for you to do your other trade union work, because some of the racism sadly comes from trade union colleagues, and that makes life very, very difficult. All of us who work in those very white and sometimes very hostile workplaces need to think about how we support each other. So I try and say more and more to people, look, there's not many of us. For God's sake, don't get into a fight with the only other black person you can see, which can happen. So one of the things we all need to remember is, one of my favourite slogans from the Palestinian struggle is existence is resistance. That if you can't sustain yourself, we're not going to build a bigger movement. So part of what we need to do is find ways of just buoying each other up enough that we get through it. And then, of course, there are bigger plans to be made and bigger demons to be slain.
I think it's really important that we do need to build alliances with white colleagues, and there are many white colleagues that have stood by me, and building that level of trust is really important, because once you've established that trust, then you can begin to express, I think, your deeper kind of anxieties and experiences.
If you're part of this society is diversity is its reality, and therefore if you work in academia, you're working in that reality. I'm only in a situation where I can challenge kind of racism because generations walked before me and on whose shoulders I stand, and who challenged far more than I will ever be called upon to challenge, and kind of gave their lives and their freedoms. I don't really see it as challenging, I just see it as kind of the way that you have to be if you believe in human and social and racial justice.
Any colleague who feels that they might be vulnerable to managerialism, if you want, and kind of disciplinary mechanisms, as I always say that if you ever receive any accolades from anywhere, from students, from managers are really important, and from outside bodies, try to record those, try to keep a copy of those. It might be an email, it might be a letter, anything, and just create your file. Now, kind of somewhat amusingly say that I've been preparing for my industrial tribunal for the last 30 years.
I think there is kind of some unconscious bias, but I'm not perhaps prepared to be to give that kind of get out of jail card. I think some of it, if it is unconscious, then that really is of significant concern, because what else do we have to do and say and write and talk about and present on in order for supposedly intelligent people who are educating the next generation of young people and not so young people, and who are spearheading supposedly groundbreaking research to get any degree of consciousness. I mean, I became conscious of racism when I was about 4. Right? And I hadn't read a book on racism, I hadn't been to a lecture on racism, hadn't been to a seminar on kind of racism, but I knew at the age of 4 what racism was. Institutions have managed to make some change that have benefited white middle-class women, even if their bias around gender was unconscious. They have consciously taken steps and taken actions. I mean, there hasn't been much use to kind of black and minority women, of course, but or probably working class women, but they have done things consciously to improve the profile. So a little bit of consciousness might be, might be very welcome. As someone who's both black and a woman, I might get two shots.
If you feel like you can't have every battle and you pick the important ones. I've never actually had a racist grievance upheld, but what I often find is that challenging the behaviour is often enough just to get the institution or get the manager or whatever the issue is to back off, and often the situation has improved for the member. So although I think institutions are incredibly reluctant to admit any discrimination, if they are challenged, they will often change their practices.